Hey, this is Dan Holmes at Baseball Egg. What I'm going to do in this video today is look at ESPN.com's top 100 MLB players of all time. This is a list that their staff put together. There's no byline on this. They put this together in February of 2022 on ESPN.com. I think this was an effort to create some content around baseball during the lockout, so that certainly makes sense. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to compare it a little bit to some of the lists that we have over at Baseball Egg, but also just mainly just react to this. So at number 100, they have Barry Larkin, which is a pretty good ranking, actually. Over at Baseball League, we also have Barry right around 100. This is a guy who was multi-talented, a five-tool player, played his entire career with the Reds. He suffered a serious arm injury in the middle of his career, and sometimes he gets overlooked because his career overlapped with Cal Ripken Jr., Robin Yount, and then later on, uh, Jeter, A-Rod, and Nomar came into the game. And Larkin had a few years there where he was hurt and missed quite a bit of time. So that makes his career look a little bit less value, but on a rate percentage wise, he's one of the better shortstops, certainly a top 10 shortstop of all time. And this makes a lot of sense to see him at 100. Phil Niekro comes in at 99. ESPN.com talks about their criteria being career value, peak performance, and then contributions to the game. Phil Niekro had a career that nearly spanned a quarter of a century. Pitchers who don't throw hard are often underrated, and I think Phil Niekro is definitely underrated as an all-time pitcher. I would have put him a little bit higher than this. I mean, it's hard to argue with a guy that pitched over 5,400 innings, 95 WAR, an ERA of about 3.3, ERA plus of about 120. I mean, this is one of the all-time greats. Number 98 is Jim Thome, the slugger that played primarily with the Indians and the White Sox, the Phillies. I think this is probably pretty decent. I think over at Baseball Ag, we have Tommy just a little bit higher. He gained a lot of walks. He was a powerful hitter, as we said, but he didn't play in the field a lot. He had a 73 WAR. That's a baseball reference WAR because he played so much at DH. I think this is probably a pretty decent rating, though. Adrian Beltre is ranked 97th, the third baseman, who reached a number of career milestones. He hit over 450 homers and had over 3,000 hits. Now, one of the things with Baseball WAR, Baseball Reference WAR, is they have Beltre at 93.5 B WAR. Now, that's not the be all end all. You'll see with this, I'm not making every decision on how I react to this list based on statistics alone. But I think the Baseball References wins above replacement definitely overstates the value of the defense of third baseman. We'll see that with Scott Rowland, who is a very popular Hall of Fame candidate right now. We see it with guys like Buddy Bell and some other guys that are third basemen, Greg Nettles. I think they're maybe just a little bit overstated. But Beltre in the top 100 is fine given his career, his longevity. Charlie Gehringer is at number 96. I think he's a bit low here. It's easy to forget. This guy played just over 20 years. He was a 320 hitter with over 400 on base percentage. And had there been gold gloves back then, he would have won a few gold gloves. There's no doubt about it. Certainly, he did play before World War II, didn't play in the integration era. So you get discounted a bit for that. But still, in my mind, Charlie Gehringer is one of the top 5 second basemen. And you'll see on this list that ESPN has more second basemen ahead of him than I think they should. Number 95 is Duke Snider. I think Duke Snider is ranked too high here. We don't even have him in our top 100 over at Baseball Egg. Part of the reason is that, for about half of his career, Duke Snider was a platoon player. He didn't really hit left-handers real well. I think his defense in center field was a little bit overrated. I think he ends up here at 95 for ESPN.com because he's one of that boys of summer, Brooklyn Dodgers heroes and stars of the 1950s. There's nothing wrong with him being on the list. I can see why he's here. I just disagree. I think he's probably just outside the top 100. ESPN is interesting. They have Bryce Harper at number 94. I think, only 10 years played. Yes, he's won 2 MVPs, but I think this is overstating it. He hasn't filled out the rest of his career yet. I think, for example, Mookie Betts is already ahead of Bryce Harper because of his overall game and the things that he does defensively and on the base pass. Talking about Mookie Betts. So I think Harper's ranked too high here. I think he will end up in the top 100, maybe even top 50, but I think this is way too premature. And then number 93, we have John Smoltz. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these guys in depth, but I think you guys probably know a lot about Smoltz. The next guy is 92, At 92 was Roy Halladay, basically a contemporary of Smoltz, pitched mostly in the other league. Went on to the Phillies after that, had some big moments, pitched a no-hitter in the postseason, one of only two. Certainly a worthy Hall of Famer. Didn't have the longevity, but I think in the top 100, that's fine. Ryan Sandberg's at number 91. We have him ranked roughly around 6 or 7 among second basemen, maybe a little lower than that. His career was fairly short. He had 282 home runs, just over 1,000 RBI. His 67 WAR. There's other second basemen that were ahead of that. Lou Whitaker, for example, higher than that. I think that he deserves some mention, but we won't see him on this list. Number 90 is Pudge Rodriguez, the second Pudge. I think that this is interesting to see him here because this indicates that ESPN is going to have probably a number of catchers on their list. Now, that we'll talk about a little bit later, but certainly one of the better defensive catchers of all time. I just think having him at 90, it'll be interesting to see how many catchers they have. At number 89 is Shoeless Joe Jackson. I don't have a lot to say about him. He deserves to be in the top 100, even though his career was shortened because he was banished from organized baseball. But I think it's fine where he's at. I don't think I would have had Willie Stargell at 88. ESPN.com does. I think over at Baseball Leg, we don't have Stargell in the top 100. And that's mostly because he was never a good defensive player. Even though he played a long time, he didn't reach 500 home runs. He was certainly a great slugger. He didn't walk like some of the other sluggers did, like Willie McCovey, for example. His WAR, career WAR, is 57.5, which really isn't all that many. It isn't all that high of a figure. There are a number of outfielders that had a higher B WAR than that. But Willie has a lot of the narrative, right? Key member of several teams that won the pennant. 79, he was the MVP and the MVP of the World Series. So he's a Hall of Famer, no doubt. I just don't think he belongs right inside the 100. Here's the other Pudge, Carlton Fisk at 87. I think that he definitely deserves to be rated ahead of Pudge Rodriguez and had a long career. So I think it's solid that we see Fisk here. At 86, to see Robbie Alomar. I think it's interesting they have him ahead of Charlie Gehringer. I don't think I would have done that. I think that Alomar is probably 15 to 20 spots below Gehringer. This just shows that they're probably ESPN is giving a little more credence to some modern players and maybe the flashy defense that Alomar had. But if you really look at the statistics, offensive side, I think Gehringer was a better second baseman. And I would also argue that Ryan Sandberg is probably pretty close. And they have Alomar ahead of Sandberg. Jim Palmer's at number 85. I'll talk about pitchers more in depth later. 84, we have Paul Molitor, who started his career as a third baseman. Actually, started his career as a second baseman, and then later moved to third base. The Brewers really were looking for a spot for him. He was never a particularly great defender, and then spent a lot of time at DH. So ended up hitting a lot of milestones. A superb hitter. He was compared a lot to Joe DiMaggio. Ted Williams, for example, compared Molitor's swing and approach at the plate to Joe DiMaggio. Hall of Famer, he should be. I think this is a pretty good rating, actually. Okay, here we go with another catcher. I think catchers are going to be an interesting topic to talk about with this list. Roy Campanella at number 83. I got to disagree with this. I see that ESPN is listing his Negro Leagues years, about 7 or 8 years he played there. He didn't play a lot of games in the Negro Leagues. Certainly he's worthy of the Hall of Fame. He's one of the great catchers of all time. I like Roy Campanella. I just don't think he played long enough, nor did he play in an era when he was playing against some of the better players. So it wasn't his fault. He was in the Negro Leagues, no doubt about it. I just don't think that I would rank him ahead of, for instance, Carlton Fisk, who came along about 20 years later. Eddie Collins at 82. He's a really important figure in baseball history. He deserves to be remembered for good reasons and for some bad reasons. He did start his career a long, long time ago, 1906. I think that he is a little bit underrated because of the fact that his power stats don't look good. He played during the dead ball era, but probably a little bit low at 82 for my taste. Okay, here's another catcher, Mike Piazza at 81. I would take umbrage with this. I would not take Mike Piazza over Carlton Fisk or Pudge Rodriguez, either one of the Pudges. If you came to me and you said, look, here's Mike Piazza, here's Carlton Fisk, and I knew what their careers were going to end up being, and I could pick one of them to build my team around, I'm going to take Carlton Fisk. Because even as good as Mike Piazza was with the bat. He wasn't really a catcher, right? Like he caught, there's no doubt about it, but he was really bad behind the plate. He gave up a lot of runs by the fact that he couldn't stop base stealers. He was not a very good defensive catcher or calling games. Famously, there were a lot of pitchers that didn't like throwing to him. He was really a DH, but he caught, and he deserves to be among the great catchers of all time. I just wouldn't put him ahead of Pudge Rodriguez, who's a contemporary, or Carlton Fisk. Number 80 is Robin Yount, our second Brewer on the list. I think he deserves to be here. Maybe I would have nudged him up a little bit higher, but it's good to see Robin Yount on the list. Number 79, Hank Greenberg. This is great because it seems to me that this means ESPN has given Greenberg credit for the 3 or 4 years that he missed in his prime when he went off and fought in World War II. He only had 55 WAR, but he had 331 home runs and missed 4 years. He hit 58 home runs one year. He had over 180 RBIs one year. He wasn't Lou Gehrig. He wasn't quite Jimmy Fox, but he was really, really close. So I think he deserves to actually be even a little bit higher than this. But I'm just glad that ESPN has him listed because often he gets overlooked when people talk about the great sluggers or the great first baseman. I think he deserves to be in the top 5, 6 of first baseman. A lot of times he gets overlooked. Chipper Jones at number 78. I think this is really low. I think Chipper's probably a top 50 player. He played third. He played left field. He was a switch hitter, arguably maybe one of the 3 or 4 best switch hitters ever. Played on important teams. Played in the World Series. Definitely think Chipper deserves to be higher than this. We got Vlad Guerrero at 77. I think that's fine. Here we go, 76, Cap Anson. Now, Cap Anson started his career in 1871, which is essentially when Major League Baseball began, as far as historians consider it. I think that it's gutsy for ESPN to go back and find a player in the 19th century who played his entire career during that century. I just don't think that Cap Anson deserves to be in the top 100 because of the quality of play at that time. The quality of baseball at that time was much different than it would be even 20 to 30 years later. For example, I personally think that had Cap Anson come along, say in 1915, and been a first baseman and been a contemporary of guys like Jake Daubert, Jack Fournier, and Ed Kenichi, and later Lou Gehrig, and those guys, that he would just been another pretty good first baseman. George Sisler, I think it would have been right in that group below Gehrig as a decent first baseman, but he wouldn't have been anything all that special. He just looks really great because he was a really good athlete that played in the 19th century against inferior competition. At 75, you have Rod Carew. That's fine. 74, Juan Marshall, followed by teammate Willie McCovey, 2 giant legends. Over at Baseball Egg, I'm going to flip over there right now. Here you look at what we have. We have McCovey at 97. So I think that ESPN has him a little bit higher than I would have expected. But, it's good to see Willie in the top 100. 72 is Justin Verlander. This is ESPN's list. We're going to see later why I have a problem with this when we get to some other ratings. But Verlander certainly has put his credentials out there. He's done a lot of things. He is arguably the best starting pitcher of his era, but we'll get more into that later. Okay, here's the first one that I really have a real problem with, and I'm trying to be objective. I am from Michigan. I am, at least have been a Tiger fan all my life. Al Kaline at number 71 bothers me. It's because of the guys that we're going to see in front of him. I have to remember, Al Kaline played 22 seasons, and probably for about 17 or 18 of those seasons, he was an all-star caliber player. A 4, 5, 6, 7 WAR guy. He had 2 or 3 years when he was legit MVP candidate. He never did win the award, but he won a batting title, famously the youngest guy ever to. He did have some injuries, but you got to look at 92 WAR. There's not a lot of guys over 90 WAR. He was also a tremendous defensive player. He was really a center fielder that was playing the right field. I think this is pretty low for Al Kaline. And here's one of the reasons why. Harmon Killebrew is listed as 70th, one spot in front of Al Kaline. I just don't understand how you can come to that conclusion. They were exact contemporaries. Kaline came into the American League in 1953. Killebrew came into the American League in 1954. They essentially played against each other for 2 decades. Nobody ever would have traded Al Kaline for Harmon Killebrew. Wouldn't have happened. Al Kaline was a multifaceted, all-around superstar player. Harmon Killebrew was an amazing slugger. Deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Great guy, one of the great twins, but he wasn't better than Al Kaline. Number 69 is Ozzie Smith. Now, I've had other reaction videos I've seen which really pan this, that really get on this pick because they don't think Ozzie should be this high considering his offensive game. Here's the thing, though. If you're going to use some sort of formula or basis using, for instance, wins above replacement, you just can't argue against the fact that the defensive stats for Ozzie Smith are off the charts. He's clearly the best defensive shortstop in history during his peak and over the course of his career. And it's just that what happens is it's hard for us to see as fans a shortstop save a team 20 runs, right? It's just you can see a few flashy plays, but there's no category that, at least there wasn't back then, and even today it's ignored, that shows, oh, okay, this guy saved 20, 25, 30 runs for his team playing shortstop. But that's just as important as an offensive player producing 20 more runs on the offensive side. And Ozzie was about replacement level as an offensive player, just a little bit below. But his defense was so great, he deserves to be ranked. I think it might be just a little high, but it's fine. 68 is Manny Ramirez. I wouldn't have put him in the top 100. We don't have him in the top 100 at Baseball Egg. This is a guy who was suspended for using performance-enhancing drugs. But I got to say, when he was in his prime, when he was really raking, there were only maybe 4 or 5 other right-handed hitters I've ever seen who had the bat speed, who had the power of Manny Ramirez. And he did impact a number of playoff races and postseason. So he was a great player. He's worth remembering. I just don't think that he could be in the top 100 if you factor in PEDs. Number 67 is Brooks Robinson. I just don't see this. Now, we'll pair this with Cal Ripken next. 2 Orioles legends back-to-back. Brooks Robinson ahead of Al Kaline, for example. I don't think anybody, again, would have traded Kaline for Robinson. Robinson wasn't anywhere in the category of offensive player of say, an Al Kaline or Harmon Killebrew or something like that. His defensive stats were great, 78 WAR. But I think that he's fine at 67. I just have a problem with some of the guys behind him. And Cal Ripken, this is one of the first ratings here where I really have to take a lot of offense to. Cal Ripken Jr., like him or not, think he was an egomaniac or not, which I do. I think the guy was an egotistical guy. He was selfish pursuing the streak. I don't like the streak. But you got to be fair and try to be objective. And the guy had 96 WAR. He was at his peak, had some of the best seasons a shortstop ever had. His defensive rate stats are fantastic. He wasn't Ozzie Smith, but he was pretty darn good, and he did it for 20 years. And offensively, he ushered in an era where we had guys come along that were great power-hitting shortstops. The numbers just don't lie. This guy's a top 30 player all time because of his longevity and the peak that he had. So having him at 66 is just troubling to me. I don't understand it. Here's another active player, Max Scherzer. I think that Max Scherzer is a Hall of Famer. Actually, over at Baseball Egg, when you talk about the top 100 all-time players, we have Max Scherzer lumped in with some of the active players like Verlander and a few others I'll talk about later. I just think it's a little bit early, and this is a bit high for Max Scherzer for my taste. At 64 is one of the greatest third basemen of all time. This might be just a little bit low. Got on base, played solid defense at third base, was important to a number of great teams. I think Eddie Matthews deserves to be a little bit higher than this. Okay, here we go. David Ortiz at 63. This is really a joke. David Ortiz was a DH 90% of his career. He got absolutely no value out of his glove. That means that if you're going to be one of the all-time greats, certainly 63rd all-time, meaning there's only 62 guys in history that were better than you, you got to be an outstanding off-the-charts offensive player. And Ortiz, as good as he just wasn't that great. 380 on base percentage, 552 slugging percentage, playing in an era when offense was booming. There's certainly that suspicion about PEDs, but even if we take that off the table completely, which I'm willing to do, no chance that you have David Ortiz as a 63rd. Actually, if you go over to baseballegg.com and you look at our list of top 100 first basemen, David Ortiz isn't even ranked among the top 10 first basemen all time. I don't think he's even in the top 20. So it's because he doesn't get any credit for the glove. and that's part of the game. So you have to rank people based on the totality of what they brought to the table. And this is just a silly uh, ranking here. Must be recency bias, must be Boston bias. There must be from ESPN.com to look at what Ortiz did in the postseason, which is just fine. It's their list. They make their list. I make mine, but that's my opinion. Mel Ott is one of the great sluggers of all time. He gets overlooked quite a bit, and that's too bad because this was a guy who really wasn't that far off from a Babe Ruth. Honestly, he really wasn't. 300 batting average, 400 on base percentage, 500 slugging percentage. For the National League, he was that big power hitter in that Babe Ruth era. Outstanding ball player. He deserves to be up probably about 15 or 20 spots from where he's at on ESPN.com. Okay, here we are with Carl Yastrzemski. I'm going to bunch these next couple ones together, okay? So we've got Carl Yastrzemski at 61 and Whitey Ford at 60. So I don't know, maybe there are a number of guys who just love the pinstripes who helped ESPN.com put this list together, but there's no way that you can rank Whitey Ford ahead of Carl Yastrzemski. Carl Yastrzemski played over 3,000 games, and it wasn't just hanging on. Over 3,400 hits, over 450 home runs, over 96 in WAR, almost 1,900 RBIs. He won a triple crown. He had a 285 batting average, even though he played during the second dead ball era in the 60s as much of his career. And he was a Gold Glove left fielder. No chance that you could have Whitey Ford ranked ahead of Carl. I mean, Whitey Ford had some years where he was used merely to face teams in must-win games, which is really important, but he didn't pitch a ton of innings. He only pitched about 3,000 innings in his career. So I just can't see how you can put Whitey Ford ahead of Carl Yastrzemski. At 59, we have Miguel Cabrera. I think it's probably a pretty decent rating for him. It's probably a little bit higher than we have him at Baseball Leg. But again, at Baseball Leg, we really look at contributions overall, including defense. And Miggy's defense, I think he's a little underrated by experts sort of discount how good he was defensively. But he didn't really bring a lot statistically from his defense, and that hurt him a little bit. 58 is Steve Carlton. 57 is Pete Alexander. Two Phillies pitchers. Dave Winfield's at 56. Interesting, you have Reggie Jackson at 55, who played with Winfield in New York. I don't think you can put Reggie Jackson ahead of Al Kaline. I don't want to make this an Al Kaline video, but just look at the numbers. 74 WAR for Reggie. Kaline over 95. I guess if you're going to look at peak, but even at peak, I don't have it in front of me, but even at peak, Reggie's peak seasons, it's peak 7, peak 5, peak 3, whatever you want to pick, aren't as good as Al Kaline. It just doesn't look as good because Al Kaline had a lot of years where he hit 25, 27, 28 home runs. He didn't hit 35, 40 home runs like Reggie did. So this is definitely something a little off. Nothing against Reggie. Reggie deserves to be among the top 100. I think actually Reggie's maybe even a little bit underrated overall among baseball fans. But I don't think he deserves to be this high compared to other players at his position on this list. I'm shocked to see Lefty Grove way down at 54. We certainly have to make an account for players who toiled back before integration and before World War II. But this far down for Lefty Grove, arguably the greatest left-hander of all time. Even if you don't want to say that, he's got to be in the top 3 or 4 among left-handers. So I just don't see how you can put him at 54. He's got to be a little higher than that. Here's our first Negro Leaguer, Oscar Charleston, who was often called the Black Tie Cobb. He played a little bit after Cobb, came in a few years after Cobb debuted, but he played in that era, around World War I era. He was a 5-tool player. It's really tough. I applaud ESPN for including guys like this. It's tough to rank these guys. It was tough when we did it. Baseball Ag. We have, I think, ended up at like 7 or 8 Negro League players in our top 100. We also sprinkled them through our top 100 at the positions where we thought that was appropriate. Charleston deserves to be in the top 100, though, based on the narrative and the stories you hear about him from historians. So I don't have a problem with this. Okay, so this one harks back to Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer. Clayton Kershaw is ranked 52nd, the 52nd greatest player of all time by ESPN.com. He has played about 14 seasons. If you look at the stats, he has over 70 WAR, which then you start talking about Hall of Fame status. He certainly is a Hall of Famer because of his peak and the things he's done. But you really can't objectively look at the numbers and compare him to, say, Verlander and say that Verlander is 20 spots below him. The only way you can really justify it is if you're talking about Dodger mystique and things like that. That's really what this is. It's really a ranking because he's compared as a lefty to Sandy Koufax, the Dodgers, and so on. But Justin Verlander pitched better in the postseason, has been just as important to playoff runs and pennant runs. He has more hardware overall. I just think that, and he's been more durable. So I think that this is a curious ranking to have him about 20, 25 spots higher than Justin Verlander. 51 is Ernie Banks, the Chicago Slugger, played shortstop, then also went to first base later in his career. Let's go to the top to 50 to 26. And before I go to this next section, I just want to remind people I'm taking a look at the ESPN.com top 100 MLB players of all time. This list was put together in February by their staff. There are comments written by several different people that are part of ESPN.com's staff. Kudos to them for making this list. I know how hard it is. Over at baseballegg.com, we have lists 100 deep for every position. So you can see who the 77th best shortstop was, or the 43rd and the 42nd best catchers are, and so on. And I know just how hard it is to make these lists. So I'm not trying to be harsh on ESPN.com. I will be honest with my assessment, but we're just going to step through these and let's go and get to it and go to number 50. Okay, here we see Bob Feller. I think it's interesting. I think he deserves to be higher than this. This guy was right in the heart of his career when he went off and fought World War II. Probably gets to 350 wins, if not for that. Certainly breaks Walter Johnson's record for strikeouts. At that time, he was striking about 300 to 350 guys a year. So I think he would have gotten that record too. I think this is a bit low because Bob Feller's been underrated because of a number of reasons. But just looking at what he did, the 266 wins, you can't just look at that. You have to factor in that he missed several years in World War II. Okay, Frank Thomas is a much better player than David Ortiz.
Your daughter is a very good
Well,
kisser.
let me get this annoying ad video. Frank Thomas is a much better hitter than David Ortiz and better player. He deserves to rank ahead of David Ortiz, but similar to David Ortiz, who comically was listed 63rd on this list of the 100 greatest players of all time. Thomas is a little bit high here because he didn't play in the field enough. Now, if we go back to Baseball Egg, I'm going to find Frank here on our list. You'll see what we have. We have Frank at 60th. So it's not that far off, actually. And you see that Frank is at 49. But I think it's a little bit high for Frank Thomas. 48 is Nap Lajoie. I'm going to talk later about players who started their career before, say, 1915. And that'll cover guys like Nap Lajoie. Warren Spahn is tragically underrated at 47. I think this is really silly. This isn't even a guy who played his entire career, bulk of his career in the pre-integration era. I mean, his best seasons were all after World War II and after integration. He pitched into the mid-60s. The winningest lefty, of course, famously of all time. He needs to be in the top 25. This is just an oversight. I don't understand how you can rank him. Below, for example, number 46, Ichiro Suzuki, who we don't even have on our top 100 over at Baseball Egg, and we like Ichiro. I like him a lot. I love the way he played. I love seeing him. He was like being able to watch the dead ball era come to life in the 21st century. And even if you give him credit for the Japanese years, and I think you should, because it was clear when he got here in 2001 that Ichiro was one of the better players, professional baseball players in the world right away. So it wasn't like you can't count the years he was in Japan. It wasn't his fault. He played over there. So I think he can get some credit for that. I just don't think he makes the top 100. 60 WAR, even if you give him a little bit more, I think he's on the edge of it. Wade Boggs at 45, he had 91 WAR, and he made himself into a pretty good third baseman. As much as I hate to say it because I love George Brett, I think Boggs probably ranks just slightly ahead of George Brett all time at third base. And you could make an argument for him to be number 2 ahead of Eddie Matthews. So I think 45 is a little bit low for Wade Boggs. And then here we go, Tony Gwynn at 44. Tony Gwynn and Wade Boggs are often thought of at the same time. Both left-handed hitters, both won a number of batting titles, both frequently had 200 hits. But the difference being that Wade Boggs got on base about 25 more times a year than Tony Gwynn, which makes up for any defensive edge that Gwynn had, which was just marginal, or any base running edge. So Tony Gwynn shouldn't be ahead of Wade Boggs. If we go back over here and see where we have him on Baseball Egg, I think Tony Gwynn is somewhere down around, yeah, he's at 95. So you see here, I've got him down here in this area. And that's because of the fact that he didn't draw a lot of walks, because his defense was pretty much marginal. So I think that that's why we have him there. Coming at 43 with ESPN is George Brett. This seems pretty low. Maybe about 8 or 10 spots off. They do have him ahead of Wade Boggs. Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. I mean, I think they're pretty close. But you'll see, based on a couple of guys that are ahead of Brett on this list, that this looks a little bit silly. 42 is Nolan Ryan, who went to the Hall of Fame the same year as George Brett. Ryan has been historically overrated because of the flashiness of the things he did. In fact, he played so long, through all the no-hitters, could throw over 100 miles an hour. He's sort of, in some ways, the Brett Favre of MLB. Favre threw a lot of touchdowns. Favre made a lot of crazy plays. But Favre also threw a lot of picks and did some nutty things that hurt his team. Nolan Ryan could throw the ball 100 miles an hour, but Nolan Ryan also walked a lot of guys, gave up a lot of hits, lost almost 300 games. I think that they're comparable that way. I think Nolan Ryan's more of a freak than he is an elite all-time legend. He deserves to be a legend, deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, no doubt about it. I just don't think he's in the category to be in the top 50. Satchel Paige at 41, not going to debate that too much. Here we see Jimmy Fox, who really isn't that far off from Lou Gehrig. I mean, I would definitely rate Lou Gehrig ahead of Jimmy Fox, but you'll see later how high ESPN has Lou Gehrig, which is kind of unusual, and there's a big gap, a bigger gap than I think there needs to be. Jimmy Fox gets overlooked. Yogi Berra at 39, this is too high in my opinion. Nothing against Yogi. He deserves to be considered for the top 100, but I don't think I would have taken Yogi Berra ahead of Mike Piazza, even given the defensive deficiencies. Piazza's offense is just way too good, and it occurred after the 1980s, 1990s, so he's playing against better competition, more modern baseball. Yogi Berra was still playing in what was largely segregated baseball, and the competition wasn't quite the same. Nothing against Yogi. Great, contributed a lot of world championship teams. I just think that this is too high. I would have also put Colin Fisk and probably Pudge Rodriguez ahead of Yogi Berra if I were ranking catchers. And here you have him ranked ahead of those guys by ESPN. Jackie Robinson at number 38. Right ahead of him is another second baseman, Joe Morgan. I think this is really low. Morgan is a top 20 guy to me. When you look at the totality of everything he did and the fact that he did it in a more modern era, I mean, after expansion, 100 WAR. There are some guys that had 100 WAR, 90 WAR, who played in the 30s, 40s, 50s. This is a guy who did it and played in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And he was also part of one of the greatest teams of all time. I think Morgan deserves to be a bit higher than this. At Baseball League, we have him listed as the greatest second baseman of all time. And I think this is a little bit low. Tris Speaker at 36. I'll address these players from this era a little bit later. Josh Gibson is 35 from ESPN.com's list. Here's Pete Rose at 34. I'm just curious where we have Pete Rose on the list over here. Certainly his career value is tremendous, so you can't argue with that. But his peak value, it's not what some other players were. So we got Chipper Jones at 54, Rose at 55, Spahn at 56. So, we have Rose lower than what you see here at ESPN.com. I have them at 34. Bob Gibson at 33. I don't have a problem. I think actually this probably is a little bit low. You can make an argument potentially that Bob Gibson's the greatest pitcher of all time. There are arguments you can make when you factor in everything. The importance he had to the World Series and his team's winning World Series, for example. You could make an argument. He certainly had arguably the best season of all time in 1968. So I think this is a little bit low. And here we go into another pitcher, Sandy Koufax. Okay, so this is where we're really going to get into something. Sandy Koufax is really tough to rate. We've taken some grief over at baseballegg.com, I have, for having Sandy Koufax ranked the way we do. But here's the thing about Sandy Koufax. He pitched 12 seasons in the major leagues, and for 6 of those seasons, he was trying to figure out how to pitch. He couldn't tame his pitches, and really he was average at best for 6 seasons. And that leaves him with 6 seasons where he was all-star quality or better. And he wasn't elite in all 6 of those seasons. He certainly was close in several of them. So it's just really hard for me to understand how you can rank Sandy Koufax as the 32nd best player in baseball history when he had 6 all-star seasons. Sure, if you want to debate that 3 of them, or maybe even 4 of them, are among the top 20 seasons of all time, okay, I think it's a stretch, and if you want to argue that he had more impact on World Series championships and pennants than any other pitcher, you can make that argument. I think Bob Gibson's in that argument. I think Christy Mathewson's in that argument. But 6 seasons, all right? He threw 2,300 innings. As great as he was, he just didn't pitch long enough for me to consider him at number 32, all time among all players. So I think this is high, but it's not unusual. For some reason, baseball experts, they judge most players from baseball history as far as their peak performance one way, and then a guy like Sandy Koufax, who had a really super high peak, but it was short, they rank him differently. And I think it's his charm, his mystique, the no-hitters, being in LA, with one of the great teams of that era, winning World Series and doing amazing things. He was handsome, he was popular. The tragedy that's seen as the way he ended his career because of an injury, it's somewhat mythic. Not somewhat, it is mythic, and has had this huge myth built up around it. That's great. I think Sandy Koufax is one of the greatest pitchers of all time, but I just can't see him as the 32nd best player ever. Okay, this is the problem. The biggest problem I have with the list, the top 100 list from ESPN.com. This is Dan Holmes with Baseball Egg, and we're looking at the top 100 list from ESPN.com. This is a reminder. Mariano Rivera pitched his entire career with the New York Yankees. He pitched 19 seasons. He had tremendous success in the postseason. Saved over 650 games. Easily the greatest relief pitcher ever. He deserves to go in the Hall of Fame. I don't care if he got in with all the votes or not the vote. And I like Mariano Rivera. Great. But there's just no chance you can rank Mariano Rivera as the 31st best player of all time. Think about the people that are behind him on this list from ESPN.com. Cal Ripken Jr., Jackie Robinson. That's just silly. There's just no chance that these players, Pete Rose, you mean to tell me that Mariano Rivera had a better career, more valuable career than Pete Rose did? Than George Brett did? 1,200 innings. Understand that often when he was coming into a game, he was pitching to get 3 outs, and his team had a 3-run lead. And statistics have shown that that kind of situation, save conversions are usually over 80%. So I'm not trying to take anything away from Mariano Rivera. He deserves to be lauded as the greatest, but he was a specialist. He was a specialist. There's no chance that you can throw 1,200 innings, okay, and be considered the 31st best player of all time. This is just silliness. This is about worshiping him as a mythic hero, a Yankee legend. This is overstating his greatness. And it's to the point now where you can't really even criticize Mariano Rivera's standing anyway, because people get really irritated and they start to marginalize you if you do. But you try to make the argument and they just kind of look at 56 WAR. There are about 90 pitchers all time who have 56 WAR. And there are a number of them are not in the Hall of Fame. Now, if you add on the value he added because he was helping his team win the pennant, He was winning games in the postseason, but then you have to do that for everybody. Anybody who had a great postseason needs to then get a boost because of that. This is just silliness to have him ahead of players like that had long careers and were brilliant, like Al Kaline and George Brett and on this list. There's no chance that Mariano Rivera should rank ahead of them. And so here we have Albert Pujols. This is another head scratcher. I don't know what the folks at ESPN.com have against Albert Pujols, but I don't know how you can justify having Albert Pujols um, listed as the 30th best player in baseball history. I mean, are they slamming him because the last 6 or 7 years when he played with the Angels, he was, you know, not much above replacement level as a first baseman? I just don't see that. I mean, then how can you justify having Sandy Koufax at 32? So you mean to tell me you have Pujols and Koufax pretty close? Albert Pujols is a top 10 player all time. All time. This is just a real head scratcher. Here's Johnny Bench. Okay, so let's contrast this with the previous pick. So Johnny Bench is 29th, and so that makes him the top ranked catcher on ESPN.com's list of 100 best MLB players of all time. Great. Kudos to them. Johnny Bench is the greatest catcher of all time as far as I'm concerned. But I think even Johnny Bench would tell you that he did not have as valuable or as great a career as Albert Pujols did. I think he would even admit that. He was a regular for about 10 years. He was amazing. Probably should have won another MVP. Won two as it was. On arguably the greatest team of all time, the Big Red Machine. Contributed to their championships and pennants and so on. I get it, but you can't rank him ahead of Albert Pujols. That's silly. And now here's Derek Jeter. So I guess that they're just we're in a spot now in this list where they just decided they were just going to make nonsensical decisions. Derek Jeter as the 28th best player of all time. So he was a better player, according to ESPN.com, than Albert Pujols. He's a better player, according to ESPN.com, than George Brett. He was better than Josh Gibson, better than Joe Morgan, better than Jackie Robinson. It's just not the case. Derek Jeter had a great career, deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, had great longevity, impacted a lot of postseasons and pennants, but the numbers just don't bear it out. 71 WAR. He was not a very good defensive player. This isn't about trashing him just for defense. I think Derek Jeter deserves to be in the top 50 or 60, but number 28 and ahead of Albert Pujols? No. Number 27 is Roberto Clemente. He's a bit high here. Actually, if you look at the numbers, him and Reggie Jackson and Al Kaline and Ichiro, they're all pretty close in right field. Once you give Ichiro a boost for the years he missed when he was in Japan. Those four are pretty close, statistically speaking. If you start talking about the narrative and the story around them, Clemente has a great story, but I just don't. At 27, this is, again, he's being ranked here because of his story and the legend around him. And love Roberto Clemente, and I applaud his career and all that, but I still think he ranks at number 27. Okay, from great character to terrible character. We go from Roberto Clemente to Alex Rodriguez, who's just one of the most dastardly characters, in my opinion, in the history of baseball. Now, let's just separate that, though, from his talent on the field. Outstanding player, even with the PEDs. I think he ranks in the top 3 or 4 all time among shortstops. Over at Baseball Egg, even after we penalized him for using steroids, he came out pretty close to Cal Ripken and Hannes Wagner as far as shortstops. I think if you pick any of those 3 players, I think you can make a good argument for each of them. I would go with Ripken, but so I'm just trying to show that I can be objective here. As much as I don't like Rodriguez as a person, I think that number 26 is low. I'm a little surprised they have him this low. I thought he would have been higher on ESPN. All right, let's go to the last article, which has 25 down to number 1. This would be a good time for me to mention to you that you can go over to baseballegg.com. I'm Dan Holmes from Baseball Egg. We have lists of the top 100 players of all time at every position. So you can see the top 100 first basemen, top 100 left fielders, and so on. Then we have a list of the top 100 players of all time there. We also have other content such as all-time teams, under our all-time teams category, we have picked a 28-man roster for each of the franchises. So you could check out the Boston Red Sox all-time team and see the 28 guys we picked to make up their roster all-time from Red Sox history. We even provide you with a lineup, and you can look at the team and argue with us about who you think should have been on it. So baseball history. We also comment on what's happening in baseball today. It's at baseballleg.com. What I'm doing with this video, though, is looking at ESPN.com's top 100 MLB players of all time. And now we're down to number 25. Okay, here's Christy Mathewson. I'm going to talk a little bit more about players from this era, but this is high for me because, and I'll talk later about what I think about players who played back then. Randy Johnson at 24. Okay, so when you think about Randy Johnson, you have to think about Pedro Martinez, and you have to think about Greg Maddux. In my mind, those three guys for pitchers after, say, 1985, coming up to the modern time, let's keep up guys that are active, like Verlander and Kershaw and Greinke and Scherzer, okay? But you talk about that window of time, those are the three guys, the big unit, Greg Maddux and Pedro Martinez. So ESPN.com has Randy Johnson below those other two guys. Look, I would argue that Randy Johnson probably deserves to be ahead of them. You could look at a lot of different ways. I think you could make an argument that Randy Johnson's the greatest pitcher of all time. As a matter of fact, certainly greatest left-hander of all time. I think it's between him and Lefty Grove. I think most historians put those two guys together as among the best left-handers. Some people throw in Steve Carlton, but I think Randy Johnson's a little bit low here at 24. Rickey Henderson definitely gets shortchanged when we talk about the greats of all time. And I think it's because of the fact that his ego was such that he was such a colorful character. And also, he got known for doing something that was really just one part of his game, and that was stealing bases. I mean, he stole so many bases, right? Over 1,400 stolen bases. I mean, think about how many guys in baseball history didn't get a chance to play 1,400 games. This guy stole 1,400 bases. So, but he got known mostly for that. And the fact is, he had power. He had that speed. He was a decent to good outfielder. And he got on base just about as much as anybody in the history of the game. Easily the greatest leadoff hitter ever. And he played, oh, by the way, for almost a quarter of a century. He was still a valuable ball player when he was in his mid-40s. So I think this is a little bit low. I mean, people could even argue that he was a better left fielder than Ted Williams, and I wouldn't get that mad about it. I think you can make that argument. Number 22 is Tom Seaver. Seaver's one of those guys, maybe either 6 or 7 pitchers that can legitimately be called the greatest pitchers of all time. I think Seaver's among that list. So I guess you could argue maybe this might be low, but it's tough. I will say this in ESPN.com's defense, and I found this over at Baseball Leg. The toughest thing about making the 100 players list, top 100 players list, is how do you figure out how to compare a position player with a pitcher, right? So how do you rate George Brett against Steve Carlton? How do you compare Gary Carter with Max Scherzer? How do you compare Mickey Mantle with Robin Roberts, right? And so if you use a statistical basis as maybe a foundation, like we did at Baseball Leg, we use that as a foundation. At Baseball Leg, we decided, let's look at career. Let's look at what we call long peak, which is 7 years, their best 7 years. Short peak, best 3 years. Let's look at prime, which was best 5 consecutive years. And then let's give them some credit for their contribution to championship teams. So 5 different criteria. We use that as our foundation, and that was a large basis, and it was based on wins above replacement. The trouble with pitchers and position players is that if you do that, pitchers come out really good because before 1950, a lot of pitchers pitched a lot of innings. So they accrued a large amount of wins above replacement. So if you did it based on your algorithm, even when doing a few adjustments, if you did a top 100 based on just the numbers, 40 of the guys might be pitchers. So you really have to adjust that. Otherwise, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think most people who try to do this, I know Bill James has done this. I think Joe Posnanski did this. and we certainly did it at Baseball Ag and here at ESPN, is you kind of pare it down. You try to have roughly about 20 players from each position to get into your top 100 and then pare it down from there a little bit. So it's tough to measure your pitchers and your position players. And I think Seaver's probably a little bit low for me. Cy Young at 21. We'll talk more about players. Again, Rogers Hornsby again, another pre-1920s player. He started at least in 1915. We'll talk about that. By the way, over at Baseball Leg, we're one of the few places I think that have Joe Morgan, or at least somebody other than Rogers Hornsby, listed as the greatest second baseman of all time. So I'm proud of that because I think you have to do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Number 19 is an underrated superstar, and Frank Robinson. He's number 19. Mike Schmidt, the greatest third baseman of all time, and according to ESPN's list here, he is the highest rated third baseman on this list, so that's good. Then you have a steroid user there, number 17, Roger Clemens. Joe DiMaggio at 16. This shows that ESPN, again, if we go back to looking at how they rated Kershaw and how they rated Koufax, that ESPN is ranking players, including their fame, but also giving credit for DiMaggio for the years he missed in World War II as well. 79 war, and he missed a few years in World War II. So that's something. That's saying something. I have a problem with Joe DiMaggio being in the top 20. Number 15 is Mike Trout. I think this is premature. It's still a little bit early. He's had so many amazing seasons. Yes, he does belong in, say, the top 30. But and this is a minor quibble, but I just think it's a little early to have him ahead of Joe DiMaggio, for example. Number 14 is Greg Maddux. He's one of the three with Randy Johnson and Pedro, who I think you talk about in that era as the greatest of that era after, say, 1985, or from 85 to like 2010. You can make a good argument that Maddux is the greatest pitcher of all time, and I wouldn't really quibble with that if that's what you wanted to say. Ken Griffey Jr. at number 13. Nothing wrong with this. Hannes Wagner at number 12. I'll talk a little bit more about players from this era. Here's Pedro, right? So ESPN has made the choice to pick Pedro ahead of Maddux, ahead of Randy Johnson. So, and you can see here they even have a video where they explain their choices here. So that's smart. So, Pedro's peak, if you look at his prime, so that's 5 consecutive seasons, how we rated a baseball leg. His best 5 consecutive seasons. Then you rank, say, top 3 and top 7. It's right up there. It could be the best of all time once you make adjustments for era, right? It's in there with Walter Johnson. It's in with the lefty Grove. So I could see him being ranked this high, and I have no problem with it. Sam Musial at number 10. Here's Walter Johnson. Started his career in 1907. I'll talk a little bit more about him when we get to another player on this list. I'm surprised ESPN has Barry Bonds at number 8. I thought they would have had him higher. ESPN has typically been a bit of an apologist for Barry Bonds. We discount him over at Baseball Leg because of the steroids. But even once you discount Barry Bonds for steroids, say you knock off 20, 25%, which is a lot, he still had 162 WAR. If you knock that 20% off, he's still way up there. So, I think at 8, I'm a little surprised he's not higher on ESPN's list. Mickey Mantle right in front of him. I think most lists don't have Lou Gehrig ahead of Mickey Mantle because of the difference in their defensive position. For whatever reason, ESPN.com really likes Lou Gehrig. I think that's indicative of the fact they seem to like stories. Like you saw Roberto Clemente ranked very high. I think that this Lou Gehrig one, somewhat similar. Nothing against the Iron Horse. Either he's the greatest first baseman of all time. He might be the second greatest if you want to put Pujols ahead of him. But I think 6 is a little bit high considering his defensive position and the fact that he's played in the 20s and 30s and didn't play against players of color, for example. Ted Williams, number 5. I think this is a pretty decent spot for him. Okay, so here we come to Ty Cobb. Let's talk about Cobb and let's talk about players from prior to, say, 1925. So what I'm thinking about in this discussion would be Cobb, Tris Speaker, Rogers Hornsby, Walter Johnson, the great pitcher. You could throw Eddie Collins in there, Hannes Wagner, who played in the other league, in the National League. Christy Mathewson, and then even go back to Cy Young, Nap Lajoie, you want to throw him in there. When you're talking about players prior to 1925, what you have to remember is that the game was so different. Offensive numbers were down during the dead ball era, but these guys that were really good, that would have been really good players in the 30s and the 40s had they been born then, they look even better because they were playing against inferior competition. Remember, there was no integration. We didn't have a lot of the players coming in that were college athletes and so on. Just the broad base of athletic skill and talent in the major leagues wasn't what it was even in the 1930s and 1940s. I'm talking about the dead ball era, like the players who debuted from like 1895 to 1915. So I think, I love Ty Cobb. I wrote a book about Ty Cobb. My birthday is December 18th, the same birthday as Ty Cobb. I've been a Tiger fan, so I love me some Ty Cobb. But I think that you've got to discount these guys a bit. I think Ty Cobb in the top 15 is fine. I think Walter Johnson in the top 15 is fine. I think you really have to discount some of these guys. And even when you do, though, I mean, Ty Cobb had 151 WAR. So if you discount him 20 to 30%, he's still going to be among the greatest players of all time. It's just we have to be rational. And the reason why I say this, too, is this. There are people who make lists of the greatest players of all time. And I'll put guys like Bill James out there, Joe Posnanski, who I really have a lot of respect for and love his writing. And he did a list of the top 100 players recently. But if you look at the way the lists end up, if you make a team like of the greatest players at each position, it frequently ends up that Lou Gehrig is the greatest first baseman. Rogers Hornsby is the greatest second baseman. Hannes Wagner is the greatest shortstop. And then you usually have Babe Ruth, and you may even have an outfielder like Ted Williams out there. And some people even have Ty Cobb up among them. So it's hard for me to think that here we are in 2022, that the greatest first baseman, the greatest second baseman, the greatest shortstop, and the greatest right fielder, just to take those 4 spots, all played before 1920, all debuted before 1920. It's just hard for me to really believe that that's the case. Historians are willing to be like, yeah, Willie Mays deserves to be the greatest center fielder. And some are willing to say, yeah, Barry Bonds should be considered as the greatest left fielder. And almost everybody universally thinks Mike Schmidt's the greatest third baseman. But these other spots, they cling to this. It's almost sacrilegious to say, how dare you say that somebody might have been greater than Lou Gehrig. I just think we have to start thinking about the fact that it was a completely different game, and the talent level was just not nearly what it would be even 20 years later. So that's my rant on that one. Number 3, we have Hank Aaron. I think these top 3, most lists have these 3 players. Some lists would put Bonds in the top 3. Some lists might have Ted Williams even in the top 3. But these top 3 are going to be pretty expected. Hank Aaron, number 3. Willie Mays, number 2. And ESPN has Babe Ruth, number 1. A comment on Babe Ruth. I have no problem with the way they have the list. I've had Willie Mays first before. And I would probably pick Willie Mays first because of the fact that, he played later. And that's important to me. I feel like as we advance, the players who played most recently, they were better if you start gauging them against the guys before them. But something about Babe Ruth that's interesting. When we putting together the foundational statistical process that we were going to rank players for at baseballegg.com, to rank them at every position and to rank them overall, we devised our system and spreadsheets and threw in all these players, that had at least X number of games, right? And for pitchers, we did that. And when I did that, Babe Ruth was included because Babe Ruth started as a pitcher. Here's what happened. Babe Ruth, the pitcher, ended up ranked 131st all time. So he was the 131st greatest pitcher of all time, according to our algorithm. Now, you got to adjust it a little bit because of era and adjust it because of other things. I get that. But even if you do that, he's in the top 150 as a pitcher. And then you have that whole career as a slugger in which he was just tremendous. So I have no doubt that had Babe Ruth, made his debut instead of 1914, he made his debut in 1964. Babe Ruth would have hit over 500 home runs. He would have been a 300 hitter. he would have been a great player, among the greatest ever. I just think we have to start thinking about the fact that it was a long time ago. I have no problem with Babe Ruth still being number one. It's not a surprise ESPN has him number one. You will see some lists that have Willie Mays. I've seen some lists where Barry Bonds has been listed as number one. So that's the list from ESPN.com. I hope you enjoyed me going through that. Again, you can go to baseballegg.com, check out our lists. I'd be interested in hearing in the comments section below what you think of this reaction video, if you'd like me to do more. And thank you.